Hey, it's Josh Modell. We're dropping something special in your feed today. It's a 4-part podcast series called Sound Influence, the Art and Soul of Puerto Rico, created in partnership with our friends at Atlas Obscura and Discover Puerto Rico. The series is narrated by legendary actor Luis Guzman, and it includes stories from the island featuring musicians José Rivera, Patchy Man, and Andrea Cruz, plus film director Miguel Arteta, EGOT winner Rita Moreno, and much, much more. The podcast utilizes not just interviews, but field recordings, original sound design, and original compositions to tell some of Puerto Rico's most compelling stories. Check it out.
Hola, I'm Luis Guzman, and welcome to Puerto Rico. I'm here to guide you deep into the place I love the most in the world. As fellow travelers, we will hear stories from some of the most brilliant Puerto Rico musicians, writers, and filmmakers, artists whose work and creative genius are shaped by the heart and soul of the Caribbean. The next voice you'll hear is one of the icons of Puerto Rican literature, who has written countless award-winning stage plays, worked extensively in television, and was the first Puerto Rican screenwriter ever to be nominated for an Oscar for his work on The Motorcycle Diaries. He has stories for days, so we're going to spend a little extra time with him. Are you there, mi pana?
My name is José Rivera, and I'm a writer and director.
Jose grew up in Espino, near the city of Arecibo, and his early memories are strange and beautiful.
I remember being in my crib that was covered with a mosquito net, was white, and I remember, I guess I had to have been lying on my back, and I'm looking up at the top of the canopy of the bed, and there's a really big spider just crawling along very, very slowly. And I remember thinking, I hope it doesn't fall on my face while I'm sleeping. That, and I remember trying to run away from home when I was very little, and running away from the house, and then being stopped by a thunderstorm. And a flash of lightning happened in front of me, and then I turned around and ran back home.
These memory fragments shows Jose's genius as a writer, but he also recalls more generally what his early life in Espino was like.
Espino is a barrio of Arecibo. So if you go to Arecibo and drive south, you hit these little hamlets, and this was one of them. And so we lived there. My grandparents lived there. My godparents lived there. It was a very tight little community of family. I remember listening to music. There was a lot of music in my home. My parents had these old LPs. We played a lot of music, a lot of parties. You know, we lived in the countryside where everybody had a plot of land and animals. And I just remember the presence of animals, of chickens and pigs and goats. I remember certain smells, especially after it rained. And when I've been back recently, some of those memories come back because the smells are still there.
Jose moved to the United States at the age of 5, but even after relocating to New York, Puerto Rico remained a very strong presence in his life.
I think my parents really tried to recreate Puerto Rico in our new home in America. And we went out to Long Island at a period when it was all forest. This is the late 50s, early 60s. And I think that the environment, at least in the beginning, reminded them of Puerto Rico. And everyone spoke Spanish at home. Obviously, my parents cooked the food that they had grown up with. They were able to find the ingredients because there was a town nearby called Patchogue that had a barrio that had like plátanos and yuca and bacalao and things like that. So there was always that smell of food in the home that was purely from the island. The other thing that my mother especially brought with her was the storytelling. And then at one point when I was in high school, my grandparents moved in with us. They left Puerto Rico in their 70s and moved to Long Island and saw snow for the first time. And my grandparents and my mom were avid storytellers. So they would, it's like Marquez. They would just sit around and tell stories that later on in life I read in Marquez.
That's the legendary novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
I go, wait a minute. I know that ghost story. I know that love story. And so that was a big part of keeping Puerto Rico alive for them. And my mom had just a phenomenal memory and she could entertain people for hours.
The music of Puerto Rico was a big feature of Jose's life on Long Island, though he didn't always fully appreciate it.
The music was, there was a man named Ramito. It was Jibaro music from the countryside, El Campo. And he sang about independence and farms and pride of being Puerto Rican. And he often dropped names into his songs about places that he'd lived in and loved that were on the island. And when you hear his music, there's just insanely beautiful pride in being a Puerto Rican and being from the island and knowing the island like the back of his hand. And so that was a big favorite of my parents. As a young kid living on Long Island, it was not my favorite music. I was listening to the Rolling Stones. I was enjoying the British invasion when I was a kid. Ironically, it wasn't until much later in life that I really began to love this music, and I started finding it online. Listening to it, and makes me incredibly nostalgic when I hear it now. But back in the day, it was like, oh my God, come on. I don't want to hear that. But it made my family very happy to have that music.
As a kid, returning to Puerto Rico was sadly not a possibility for Jose and his family, though he has since made up for lost time.
There was a long period when we didn't go back, but when I became older and more independent and had a job, I went back. My parents actually moved back to the island in 1979, so they had it with New York and the winter and everything. And so they moved back to the little town where they got married. So as an adult, I would visit them there. And my three youngest brothers went back with my parents. So there were a lot of visits. And there's an interesting thing about Puerto Ricans, in my experience, who had never left the island. Very different from the Puerto Rican friends that I've made in New York. There's just a sense of earthiness, a tremendous generosity, kindness, lack of pretension, which to this day, I was just there visiting family. They still have those qualities. Maybe it's just small town qualities, but it's really refreshing after being in New York.
Jose got to take his daughter to Puerto Rico some years back, and it was an extremely memorable trip for the two of them.
We went down there after she had graduated because she had never really been. And we went to San Juan, and then we just walked everywhere through Old San Juan and to the El Moro. And we really saw the city, and then got in the car and drove to Miraflores to see my family. And one of the reasons we were in Puerto Rico was I had a play that was being produced in Santurce. And it was a play about my parents. And my great aunt, Petra, was a character in the play. So we told Petra and said, please come to the play. She had never in her life seen professional theater, ever. And no one in my family had. And so they caravanned in their cars from Miraflores to San Juan, which is not close. It's a distance. 23 of them came to see the play. And it was really a great experience. It was my first play in Spanish in Puerto Rico about Puerto Rico. And so there was a kind of biofeedback where the people knew that they were seeing themselves on stage and appreciating it and laughing. And I kept thinking, wow, this is what it's like for like Chekhov to see a play in Russian or Brecht to see a play in German. And it was a great experience. My family is very religious, but there's some really saucy moments in the play that just shocked them, but shocked and delighted them. The look of shock and also happiness on their faces was amazing. Then we went out to Miraflores and everybody broke out their guitars and sang church songs and made arroz con gandules. And it was a really wonderful time.
From his many visits to Puerto Rico, often with his family, José had a deep knowledge and even deeper appreciation of the island.
Later on, I went back to Puerto Rico with my son, and we drove around the island. We went to Ponce, we went to San Juan, we went to the interior of the island, to Utuado and Adjuntas, and really got a sense of the geography.
José was always particularly taken by the stunning bioluminescent bays.
There are several on the island that are really beautiful and kind of magical. I mean, you just don't see water glowing like this. Everyone should visit Old San Juan. But the real Puerto Rico is in the countryside. It's in the little towns like Lares. The towns in the interior are really beautiful. My father came from a town called Utuado, which is more or less the geographic center of the island. And it's full of caves and waterfalls. And they used to grow coffee there back in the day. And everything is small and slow. And to me, the authentic Puerto Rican experience is those little towns. Mayagüez, which is a town in the west, is beautiful. Still has a lot of colonial architecture. I mean, the beaches are amazing. And possibly my very, very favorite part of the island is El Yunque, the rainforest, which I've been to a bunch of times. And every time it's like, holy shit, this is amazing.
Puerto Rico has featured in many of José's plays in both direct and indirect ways, but frequently is through the lens of his or his family's experience.
For me, the island is a source of inspiration as an artist, but also just as a human being. I write about family a good deal. I've written a play about how my parents met in, 1954. And Act 1 is 1954 when they meet, and Act 2 is 49 years later when they've been living in the States. And it's really sort of about the effects of having lived in the States on this couple. As I've said in the past, I am the luckiest writer that ever lived. For me, the island is a place of like deep humanity and a source of inspiration for me that I get nowhere else. Nothing else comes close.
Gracias, José. You are magician with your words, your stories. Sound Influence, the art and soul of Puerto Rico. Presented by Discover Puerto Rico is a production of Talk House and Atlas Obscura. I'm Luis Guzman. The show is written by Nick Dawson and produced by Nick Dawson and John Ahrens, with sound design and original music by John Ahrens. The executive producers are Ian Wheeler, Doug Baldinger, Johanna Mayer, and Chris Naka. On our last visit to the island, We will drop in on director Miguel Alteta.
Puerto Ricans, for a population that's so tiny, their footprint is enormous around the world culturally.
And folk musician Andrea Cruz.
And when I saw her with her guitar and that peaceful sound and that contemplation and that reflection of her music, it impacts me and still impacts me right now.